Zeboyd, come play with us.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Robert Thinks He's Right with me, Robert. Today, I'm going to rant about remakes. We've had lots of high-profile RPG remakes released or soon to be released. Major problem with remakes is that everybody wants a different thing in a remake. You have some people who want your remake to be incredibly faithful to the original thing. Some people want everything to be changed. Some people want the graphics to be changed. Some people want the music to be changed. Some people want gameplay changes. Some people want brand new content. And so, what is a game company supposed to do when you have so many different desires for different remake? How do you manage expectations, give people what they want for the most part? And as far as I can see, the answer is you don't. And I wanted to talk a little bit about two remakes in particular where it feels like the developers had no clue whatsoever what people wanted in a remake. Final Fantasy VII. Now, people have been wanting a remake for Final Fantasy VII for years and years. It is a beloved game. It sold a ton of copies. It was the first huge blockbuster hit for the series, and it was many people's first RPG. So people have been wanting a remake of it for a long time, especially given all of the fancy things they've done with Final Fantasy VII after the fact, like the Final Fantasy VII Advent Children movie, which, the quality of the movie aside, featured some very nice graphics that were much, much better than the original game's visuals. So there have been fans wanting a remake of Final Fantasy VII with similar style graphics to that for years and years. When the remake was initially teased and announced at E3, the crowd went absolutely wild. People were applauding and standing and screaming when they realized what they were seeing. So the demand was there, but what has Square Enix actually done with the Final Fantasy VII remake? Well, they completely changed the type of gameplay it is. It's now an action game. They split it up into multiple installments. So the first game, which is the only game that's out at the time of this video, just covers the first 5 or 6 hours of the original game, but takes about 30 hours to do that. And they also decided that they didn't want to keep the same story. So now Final Fantasy VII Remake is this weird multiverse sequel thing where I'm not sure how close to the original story it's going to be. It looks like it's a sequel to Final Fantasy VII where the main villain and one of the main characters know that Final Fantasy VII already happened and they're going back in time or going to another dimension and trying to make it either change or stay the same. And it's very complicated and convoluted, and I can't imagine that's what anybody who was hoping for a remake wanted. Now, having said all this, lots of people bought the Final Fantasy VII remake. Many people enjoyed it. No idea if they will keep buying this until it's over. And people, there were many people who liked it. It got some positive reviews. Some people are looking forward to the future installments. But it boggles my mind why Square Enix, when they had this game that they knew everybody wanted, why they didn't just remake Final Fantasy VII if they had kept the story and the gameplay very similar, but just updated the graphics and updated the script so it was more coherent and not a terrible English translation. If they had just taken the original game and updated the visuals, gave it some quality of life improvements, fixed some bugs, they could have had the entire game made at a fraction of the cost. It could have been one game instead of a multi-part series, and I'm sure it would have sold extremely well because I feel like that was what most fans wanted. They wanted the game that they loved, but looking better and with modern conveniences. They wanted the game they imagined in their head, not the game that it was, and certainly not this weird multiverse of madness Final Fantasy VII. Okay, and then the other obvious remake to talk about in the RPG realm is Persona 3. The remake for that was rumored for quite some time, and they announced it recently. And I believe just today they released a new trailer with the English cast in it at Anime Expo. So, Persona 3, for the people who aren't familiar with it, is a very important game for Atlas. It was set up more like an RPG crossed with a visual novel or a life sim, where instead of having a traditional RPG quest where you start in one end of the map and you go on to different towns and dungeons as you progress, the entire game takes place in one city, and there's only one real dungeon, which is several hundred floors tall, and you do a few couple dozen floors of the tower each month until you reach the top. And it was very different in style from the previous games. It was much more anime style, or much more popular anime style. The original game was a different anime style. And it was a very popular game. It was basically a soft reboot for the series, but it's a game that people have wanted a remake of for quite some time because Persona 3 came out, and then soon after they had an enhanced version, which included a bunch of improvements, and it had a post-game scenario called The Answer, which was about 30 hours long. So people liked that, and then they released a third version of the game for the PlayStation Portable system called Persona 3 Portable, which had a lot of general improvements to the game. And a big new feature of that was that instead of the original main character, you could choose to play as a female main character who had her own social links and conversations and scenes that weren't in the original game, as well as some unique music and other improvements. So, but because it was a PSP game and not a PS2 or PS3 game, they had to make some concessions on the technology, so the graphics aren't as good there as they were in the original PS2 game, and a lot of the cutscenes were changed to more of a visual novel style, whereas before they had been animated. So the problem the fan base had was that you had these two upgraded versions of the game, and neither of them was a definitive version. So everyone was super excited when they announced the Persona 3 remake was going to be based on the Persona 5 engine and have lots of improvements from that game. But then it turns out that the major new features of the two previous versions aren't in the remake. So the new character in Persona 3 Portable isn't in the remake. You can't play as her. And also the post-game mini sequel that was in the PlayStation 2 enhanced version isn't there either. So fans are furious. I've seen so many complaints, and when the game was announced, it felt like all I was seeing was complaints. And I know that the internet amplifies negative opinions more than positive opinions, but this seemed like such a huge misstep that the developers knew that a remake was wanted, but then they didn't include the stuff that people wanted the remake for. I think the remake looks great. I'm excited to play it. I'm excited to see if they add anything new to it. Just overall, it seems like such a huge marketing misstep to decide to greenlit this remake of a game, but then completely miss the main point of why fans wanted it remade in the first place. Okay, so now let's talk about some other remakes. Super Mario RPG is getting a remake. It was a very good RPG for the Super Nintendo. It was more of a beginner RPG in that it wasn't especially difficult, but also it was a good stepping stone for someone not used to RPGs because it wasn't just combat and exploration. It had little mini games here and there, and there was some platforming because it's a Mario game. So it was a great game, and a remake was announced recently for that, which, as far as I can tell, the response to that has been overwhelmingly positive. I did see something that I thought was super funny, which was a point I wanted to make was that no matter how bad the graphics in your original game are and how good the graphics are in your remake, somebody's going to complain about it. Because I saw somebody who was just like, I'm so upset that the Super Mario RPG remake, the graphics just missed the entire point of the original game. And that's not an opinion I agree with. The original game was released at a time when pre-rendered CG graphics were a new thing, and it came out around the same time as the Donkey Kong Country games came out, and I feel like that style of graphics hasn't aged very well. So the one thing I was confident was like, oh, this game is Super Mario RPG, but it doesn't have these really, really dated 90s, early 3D graphics. It has modern graphics. That's great. So I was very amused to see somebody go on a long rant about how much he hated the new graphics. So Mario RPG, I think, is going to be a big success with the remake. I've noticed that it looks very, very faithful to the original game outside of the graphics improvement. I'm hoping that it's not entirely faithful. I hope that they add some interesting new content and try to improve the gameplay where they can. Even if they don't, I think it'll be a huge best-selling game for Nintendo, and I know a lot of people are hoping that it does really good and encourages Nintendo and Square Enix to team up some more and make additional Mario RPGs or additional, games using Nintendo properties. The Star Ocean 2 remake. If you don't know, Star Ocean is a sci-fi fantasy series from Square Enix. It's an action RPG. It was commonly compared to the Tales series during its heyday because they're both games that are very JRPG in style, but when you get to combat, they're more like action fighting games. Star Ocean 2 is my favorite game in that series. And from what I can tell, the remake there is mostly changing the graphics to use the 2.5D style that has become popular with games like Octopath Traveler, where the character sprites are in 2D, but they're set up in a 3D world. And, I think it looks great, and I have not played the game in such a long time that I barely remember much about it other than that I really enjoyed it and that there's two playable characters and your story changes depending on which one you choose. And also that there is a character who is possessed by shoulder dragons, which, stood out to me after all these years that he had like an angel and a devil on his shoulder, but they were these weird snake dragon things. But I've seen people complain that they don't like the 2.5D style of graphics, which again goes back to the idea that no matter what your remake's graphics are, somebody's going to complain about them. Doesn't matter how good or bad the original game was, somebody's going to complain about the remake graphics. I really enjoyed the Lunar remakes. The second Lunar game is my favorite, but I feel the first remake was better just because the first game wasn't as good, so there was more room for improvement. Um, I I enjoyed that with the Lunar remakes, they kept the same basic gameplay while adding new features, and they especially with the first one, they weren't afraid to change the story in interesting ways while still keeping the same basic story. With the first Lunar remake, a big change they made was with the main heroine character. In the original game, she gets kidnapped by the big bad guy fairly early in the game, and she leaves your party, and then the rest of the game is trying to rescue her. But with the remake, they changed things so that the point where you thought she was going to leave the party, she doesn't at the last moment, and she stays with your party a lot longer in the remake, which I thought was a really good change that made her feel like a real character and not just a damsel in distress you had to rescue. I like the Demon Soul remake that they released on the PlayStation 5. It basically just keeps the same game as the original, but with updated graphics and better technology. The problem is that the original game didn't work very well on the PlayStation 3, which is where it came out. It had horrendous load times. The frame rate was not very good, so it made combat when lots of enemies were around to be more difficult than it should because the frame rate plummeted. So I thought that was a good example of how a relatively conservative remake um, felt like a big improvement just because it was able to fix problems with the original technology of the game, which brings up a point I wanted to mention that, and I've seen some people mention this as well, that in the game industry, we have a tendency of doing remakes of very popular games, which makes sense because you want your new game to be popular, so you pick games that were already popular and successful. But what would be great is there are many, many games that have interesting premises, but perhaps weren't very good games. They had an interesting premise, and maybe they didn't have enough of a budget, or maybe they just didn't have the design or the team skills to do the premise as well as it should have, as well as it deserved. So it would be great to see more instances of games that were flawed get remakes that turns them into the amazing game that they could have been. Like, for example, a game I have a soft spot for on the Super Nintendo was called Evo, and it's an action RPG where you start off in the very early stages of the Earth. You start underwater as a little fish, and then it evolves into a bigger fish, and then you just progress through different stages of evolution through the history of Earth, but it's a Japanese action RPG, so there's lots of weird magical nonsense, and you fight dinosaurs, and it's a really crazy, unique game. But it's not the best game, and it's an old game, so the graphics aren't the best, and the controls I remember were a little clunky. So it'd be great to see something like that get a proper modern remake and see what they could do with that kind of concept now. Yeah, thanks for listening. Keep making and playing games.
Like and subscribe, it really helps us. Thanks for watching.
Say it with some conviction, like you're not in a boiling hot room. Come on.
I am in a boiling hot room.
I know. Let's get you
Okay.
out of there.